The screech of tires against wet asphalt cut through the evening air like a blade. Downtown Chicago's financial district had emptied hours ago, leaving only the occasional cab and the steady hum of streetlights reflecting off rain-soaked pavement. The man in the expensive charcoal suit stumbled out of his black Mercedes, clutching his briefcase with white knuckles as his vision began to blur. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. He'd felt it coming during the drive from his penthouse office. That familiar electric sensation crawling up his spine, the metallic taste flooding his mouth, the way sound seemed to echo from somewhere far away. But he'd ignored it, just like he'd ignored the warnings from his neurologist 6 months ago. There was too much at stake tonight. The merger documents in his briefcase represented 18 months of negotiations that would reshape the tech industry forever. The sidewalk felt unstable beneath his Italian leather shoes as he tried to steady himself against the side of his car. His phone buzzed incessantly in his jacket pocket, probably his assistant wondering why he hadn't arrived at the restaurant yet. The Japanese investors were waiting, champagne chilled, contracts ready for signature. Everything he'd worked, for everything his company had built over the past decade, hinged on the next 2 hours. But his body had other plans. The first convulsion hit without warning. His briefcase clattered to the concrete, scattering papers across the wet sidewalk like autumn leaves caught in a sudden gust. His legs buckled and he collapsed beside his car, his head striking the curb with a sickening thud. The seizure took hold with violent intensity, his entire frame rigid and shaking as electrical storms raged through his brain. A young couple walking their dog on the opposite side of the street noticed first. The woman pointed, her voice carrying across the empty road. "Oh my God, is that guy having a fit?" Her boyfriend pulled out his phone, thumb hovering over the screen. "Should we call someone?" But even as he spoke, they both took instinctive steps backward, creating distance between themselves and the convulsing figure. Within minutes, a small crowd had gathered, but they formed a wide circle around the man, like spectators at some disturbing street performance. A businessman in a navy suit stood at the edge, briefcase in hand, checking his watch. "Someone else will handle it," he muttered to his colleague, who nodded in agreement. They had their own appointments to keep, their own lives to live. An elderly woman wrapped her coat tighter around herself, whispering to her companion, "Probably drugs. You see it all the time downtown." Her friend nodded sagely, both of them keeping their distance, as if whatever afflicted the man might somehow be contagious. 2. Teenagers on skateboards rolled to a stop, pulling out their phones not to call for help, but to record. The seizure was dramatic, almost cinematic in its intensity. "This is crazy," one of them whispered, thumb sliding across his screen to start recording. "My followers are gonna lose their minds over this." A security guard from a nearby office building emerged, drawn by the commotion. He approached cautiously, radio in hand, but stopped several feet away. Sir, can you hear me?" The man on the ground couldn't respond, his body locked in the grip of the neurological storm. The guard spoke into his radio. "Yeah, we got a situation on 5th Street. Looks like a medical emergency. Maybe drugs, maybe mental health. I'm not trained for this stuff." The seizure intensified, the man's back arching off the concrete as his muscles contracted violently. Foam began to appear at the corners of his mouth, and his breathing became labored and erratic. His expensive watch caught the streetlight. As his arm thrashed against the sidewalk, the gold band glinting like a desperate signal for help. But the crowd only grew more uncomfortable. A woman in scrubs, clearly a healthcare worker heading home from her shift, hurried past with her head down, earbuds firmly in place. She'd seen enough medical emergencies for one day. A group of college students stumbled out of a nearby bar, laughing loudly until they noticed the scene. Their laughter died, replaced by awkward silence and quick retreating steps. "Someone should do something," a voice called out from the back of the crowd. But it was the kind of statement that expected someone else to take action, not a call to personal responsibility. The crowd murmured agreement while remaining frozen in place, each person waiting for another to step forward first. The man's seizure was entering its second minute now, his body beginning to show signs of oxygen deprivation. His lips were taking on a bluish tinge, and his movements were becoming less coordinated but more desperate. The expensive fabric of his suit was tearing against the rough concrete, and blood began to seep from where his head had struck the curb. Taxi driver slowed his cab, peering through the windshield at the commotion. For a moment, it seemed like he might stop, but then the light turned green, and he accelerated away, probably relieved to avoid whatever complicated situation was unfolding. On the sidewalk, the sound of his engine faded into the distance, leaving only the harsh breathing of the seizing man and the uncomfortable shuffling of feet among the gathered onlookers. The businessman who'd been checking his watch earlier pulled out his phone and dialed 911, but his voice was detached, clinical. "Yeah, there's a guy having some kind of episode on 5th and Madison. Looks like he's on something. You might want to send someone." He hung up quickly, as if the brief call had fulfilled his civic duty, then walked away without looking back. The minutes stretched on like hours. The man's seizure was beginning to subside, but his breathing remained labored, and his consciousness hadn't returned. His body lay motionless now, except for the shallow rise and fall of his chest, vulnerable and exposed on the cold, wet pavement. The scattered papers from his briefcase were becoming soggy in the light rain that had begun to fall, ink running and blurring the carefully typed words that had seemed so important just minutes before. More people stopped to look, but none to help. They formed a human wall of indifference, each person assuming someone else would take responsibility, someone else would know what to do, someone else would care enough to act. The bystander effect was in full swing, paralyzing a dozen people, who individually might have been heroes, but collectively became a crowd of spectators. A police siren wailed in the distance, but it seemed to be heading in the opposite direction. The 911 call had been logged, but in a city of millions, one more medical emergency was just another item on an endless list of urban problems. The response time could be 20 minutes or more, depending on what other crises were unfolding across the city that night. The man's phone continued to buzz in his jacket pocket, the vibration audible in the relative quiet. Someone was looking for him, someone was waiting for him, someone expected him to be somewhere else. But he lay unconscious and alone, surrounded by strangers who saw him as nothing more than an inconvenience, a disruption to their evening plans, a problem that surely belonged to someone else. The rain was picking up now, and the crowd began to thin as people sought shelter or simply lost interest in the drama. A few lingered, morbidly curious to see how the situation would resolve, but most drifted away into the night, already forgetting the face of the man they'd left lying on the sidewalk. What none of them realized, what none of them could have known, as they walked away, was that the man convulsing on the concrete controlled a technology empire worth $47 billion. His signature was worth more than most people would earn in 1,000 lifetimes. His decisions affected millions of jobs, shaped entire industries, and influenced global markets. In boardrooms around the world, people waited for his calls, hung on his words, and competed for his attention. But here, in this moment, he was just another stranger in distress, and that was apparently not enough to compel a single person to kneel down beside him and offer the most basic human compassion. The city's indifference had reduced one of its most powerful residents to just another casualty of urban anonymity, another reminder that wealth and status mean nothing when you're alone and vulnerable on a cold sidewalk surrounded by people who've forgotten what it means to care for one another. 3 miles away from the chaos unfolding on 5th Street, the emergency department of Chicago Metropolitan Hospital hummed with its usual controlled urgency. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the sterile corridors, where the scent of disinfectant mingled with the underlying tension that never quite left a trauma center. Dr. Maya Johnson moved through the organized chaos with the fluid precision of someone who had spent 15 years perfecting her craft. At 38, she carried herself with the quiet confidence that came from saving lives when others had given up hope. Her dark skin seemed to glow under the hospital lights, and her warm brown eyes held depths that spoke of both tremendous compassion and unshakable resolve. Maya had grown up in the South Side, where medical emergencies were often matters of life and death, with no room for hesitation. Her grandmother, a woman who had cleaned hospital floors for 40 years, used to tell her stories about the nurses, who treated everyone with dignity, regardless of the color of their skin or the thickness of their wallet. Those stories had shaped Maya's understanding of what healing truly meant. Tonight, she was working the evening shift in the emergency department, a role she'd specifically requested, despite having the seniority to work easier daytime hours. The evening shift brought in the cases that most medical professionals preferred to avoid: the homeless, the addicted, the mentally ill, the victims of violence that polite society preferred to forget. Maya thrived in these moments when her skills mattered most. Her colleagues respected her medical expertise, but they respected her heart even more. Dr. Marcus Rodriguez, the head of emergency medicine, often said that Maya had an intuition for people that couldn't be taught in medical school. She could read a patient's eyes and know their story before they spoke a word. She could sense fear masquerading as aggression and hope hiding beneath layers of despair. The emergency department that evening was busier than usual. A multi-car accident on the expressway had brought in 6 patients, including 2 children. Maya had spent the last hour stabilizing a 7-year-old girl whose parents were still trapped in their overturned vehicle. The girl kept asking for her mother, and Maya had held her hand through 3 different procedures, whispering reassurances that everything would be okay. In bed 7, an elderly man named Franklin Washington was recovering from chest pains that had turned out to be severe indigestion rather than the heart attack he'd feared. Maya had spent an extra 20 minutes with him, explaining his test results and making sure he understood his discharge instructions. Franklin had no family, and Maya knew that sometimes the difference between recovery and relapse was simply knowing that someone cared about the outcome. The nursing station was Maya's command center, where she coordinated care for dozens of patients, while maintaining the delicate balance between efficiency and empathy that kept the emergency department functioning. Her colleagues, nurses, doctors, technicians, and orderlies had learned to trust her judgment implicitly. When Maya said a patient needed extra attention, they listened. When she identified someone who was sicker than they appeared, they investigated. Dr. Sarah Chen, one of the younger residents, approached Maya's station with a chart in her hand. "Maya, I wanted to thank you for catching that allergic reaction earlier. The patient with the bee sting was going into anaphylaxis, but I completely missed the early signs." Maya smiled, not with pride, but with the satisfaction of a teacher watching a student learn. The key is watching their breathing pattern change before the obvious symptoms appear. You'll start to notice it automatically after a while. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. This was Maya's gift, not just her medical knowledge, but her ability to see what others missed. She noticed when a patient's family member needed as much care as the patient themselves. She spotted the signs of domestic violence that victims were too frightened to report. She recognized when someone was having their first panic attack and needed reassurance more than medication. The emergency department's waiting room told its own stories. Families clustered together, sharing whispered conversations and worried glances. Individual patients sat alone, some scrolling through phones to distract themselves from pain, others staring at the wall with the thousand-yard stare that came from chronic illness or chronic poverty. Maya made it a point to walk through the waiting room every hour, not just to check on medical needs, but to remind people that they hadn't been forgotten. Her approach to medicine had been shaped by her own family's experiences with healthcare. Her younger brother, Jamal, had been born with severe asthma, and Maya had watched their mother navigate a system that often seemed designed to discourage rather than heal. Emergency room visits where they waited for hours because Jamal looked fine from the outside. Doctors who spoke to their mother as if her concerns were overreactions rather than a parent's legitimate fears. Those experiences had taught Maya that healing began with seeing people as fully human, not just as collections of symptoms to be treated and discharged. She understood that for many patients, the emergency room was their only access to healthcare, their only connection to a system that otherwise ignored their existence. Tonight, Maya was training Jennifer Walsh, a new graduate nurse who had started just 2 weeks earlier. Jennifer was competent and eager, but she still had the wide-eyed nervousness that came with the territory. Maya remembered her own first months, when every decision felt monumental and every patient interaction carried the weight of potential disaster. The most important thing to remember, Maya told Jennifer as they reviewed the night's cases, is that everyone who comes through those doors is someone's whole world. That homeless man in bed 3? Someone loved him once. That teenager with the overdose. Her parents are probably praying for her recovery right now, even if they don't know where she is. Jennifer nodded, but Maya could see the doubt in her eyes. It was one thing to understand compassion intellectually, another thing entirely to practice it when faced with patients who were hostile, uncooperative, or seemingly beyond help. The radio crackled with an incoming call. Chicago Metro, this is Ambulance 47. We're en route with a male patient, approximately 45 years old, found unconscious following a seizure. Vitals are stable, but he's still unresponsive. ETA 8 minutes. Maya acknowledged the call and began preparing bed 12, the trauma bay they used for neurological emergencies. She gathered the equipment they might need: IV supplies, oxygen, monitoring devices and medications for controlling seizures if they resumed. Her movements were automatic, refined by thousands of similar preparations. As she worked, Maya found herself thinking about the patient they were about to receive. A seizure could be caused by dozens of different conditions: epilepsy, brain tumor, drug withdrawal, metabolic disorders, head trauma. Each possibility required different treatments, different approaches, different levels of urgency. The fact that he remained unconscious suggested this wasn't a simple epileptic episode. Dr. Rodriguez approached her station. Maya, I want you to take point on the incoming seizure patient. Jennifer can assist, but I need your experience on this one. Maya nodded. She had handled hundreds of seizure cases, from children with febrile convulsions to adults with complex neurological conditions. Each case taught her something new about the delicate machinery of the human brain and the countless ways it could malfunction. The ambulance sirens grew louder, and Maya could see the flashing lights through the emergency department's windows. Soon, another human being would be wheeled through those doors, vulnerable and dependent on strangers for their very survival. Maya took a deep breath. Centering herself for whatever story was about to unfold, she had no way of knowing that the man currently unconscious in the back of that ambulance controlled a technology empire that touched billions of lives around the world. She didn't know about the merger documents scattered across a downtown sidewalk, or the Japanese investors still waiting in a restaurant for a meeting that would never happen. All Maya knew was that someone needed help, and helping. People was what she had dedicated her life to doing. In a few minutes, she would meet a patient who would challenge everything she thought she knew about compassion, justice, and the true meaning of service to others. The automatic doors of Chicago Metropolitan Hospital burst open with a pneumatic hiss as the paramedics rushed through, their patient strapped to a gurney that rattled across the polished floor. Maya stepped forward to meet them, her trained eyes immediately assessing the unconscious man as they transferred him to bed 12. "What do we have?" she asked, falling into step beside the lead paramedic, a veteran named Tom Bradley, whom she'd worked with countless times over the years. "John Doe, found seizing on 5th Street about 20 minutes ago," Tom reported, his voice clipped and professional. "Witnesses say the seizure lasted at least 3 minutes, maybe longer. He's been unresponsive since we arrived. No ID, no emergency contacts, no medical alert bracelet. His pupils are reactive but sluggish, blood pressure elevated at 180 over 110, heart rate being steady around 95. Maya's hands moved automatically as Tom spoke, checking the patient's airway, pulse, and responsiveness. The man was well-dressed despite the dirt and dampness from the street. His suit was expensive, his shoes were Italian leather, and his watch clearly cost more than most people's monthly salary. But none of that mattered now. What mattered were the subtle signs that told her this seizure was different from the routine cases she usually handled. Dr. Rodriguez appeared at her shoulder, pulling on gloves. "Status?" "Postictal, unresponsive for 20-plus minutes," Maya replied, attaching, monitoring leads to the patient's chest. "That's longer than typical for a generalized tonic-clonic seizure. Could be status epilepticus, could be something more serious." As the monitors came online, Maya noticed something that made her pause. The man's breathing pattern was irregular. Not the deep, labored breathing she'd expect from someone recovering from a major seizure, but something more subtle and concerning. His oxygen saturation was acceptable at 94%, but his carbon dioxide levels were elevated, suggesting his brain wasn't regulating respiration normally. "Dr. Rodriguez, look at these respiratory patterns," she said, pointing to the monitor, "and his Glasgow coma scale is concerning. He's not responding to verbal stimuli at all. Minimal response to pain." Dr. Rodriguez frowned as he performed his own neurological assessment. "You're right, this isn't typical post-ictal confusion. Get me a full neuro workup, CT scan, EEG, complete metabolic panel, and check his blood glucose. Also run a tox screen." As Maya began drawing blood for the laboratory tests, she noticed something else that troubled her. The patient's hands were soft, manicured, with no calluses or signs of manual labor. His skin had the pallor of someone who spent most of their time indoors, likely in an office environment. This wasn't a homeless person or drug addict, as the paramedics had initially assumed based on where he was found. "Tom, you said witnesses saw the seizure," Maya asked as she labeled blood tubes. "Yeah, but nobody wanted to get involved. Typical downtown crowd, lots of lookers, no helpers. One businessman called 911, but nobody actually assisted until we arrived." Maya felt a familiar knot of frustration in her stomach. She'd seen this pattern countless times. People who would rush to help if the victim looked like them, dressed like them, seemed worthy of their compassion. But let someone appear different, vulnerable, or potentially dangerous, and suddenly everyone became very busy with their own affairs. Jennifer Walsh, the new nurse, approached hesitantly. "Maya, should I start an IV?" "Yes, but use the 18-gauge needle. If this patient needs emergency medications, we'll need good access." Maya watched as Jennifer prepared the IV equipment, noting the slight tremor in the young nurse's hands. "Jennifer, what concerns you most about this patient?" Jennifer paused, considering. "Well, the prolonged unconsciousness is worrying, and—" she hesitated. "The way he's dressed doesn't match where he was found. It's like there's something we don't know." Maya nodded approvingly. "Good observation. Always trust your instincts when something doesn't add up." Dr. Chen, the resident Maya had spoken with earlier, joined them at the bedside. I've ordered a CT scan, but radiology is backed up from the car accident earlier. It'll be at least 30 minutes. That's too long, Maya said firmly. This patient needs imaging now. Dr. Rodriguez, can we prioritize this case? Dr. Rodriguez looked at her carefully. Maya didn't make requests like this lightly, and her clinical instincts were rarely wrong. What are you thinking? Look at his presentation, Maya said, pointing to the monitors. Prolonged unconsciousness, elevated blood pressure, irregular respirations, and these subtle tremors in his left hand. This could be increased intracranial pressure from a brain bleed or tumor. If I'm right, every minute we wait increases the risk of permanent damage or death. As if summoned by her words, the patient's condition began to deteriorate. His blood pressure spiked to 200/115, his heart rate dropped to 60, and his breathing became more labored. Maya recognized the signs immediately. Cushing's triad, a neurological emergency that indicated dangerous pressure building inside the skull. He's herniating, she announced, her voice cutting through the controlled chaos of the trauma bay. We need that CT now and get neurosurgery on the phone. Dr. Rodriguez was already moving. I'll call radiology myself. Maya, start him on mannitol. To reduce the brain swelling. Jennifer, get the crash cart ready just in case. As Maya prepared the emergency medication, she noticed other staff members hovering at the edges of the trauma bay. Some were genuinely concerned and ready to help, but others wore expressions she'd seen too many times before, a mixture of curiosity and judgment. She could almost hear their unspoken thoughts. Another indigent patient consuming expensive resources, another John Doe, who would probably skip out on the bill if he survived. Dr. Lisa Park, one of the attending physicians, approached the bedside with a clipboard. Maya, do we have any insurance information on this patient? The administration is asking about authorization for the CT scan and potential surgery. Maya felt her jaw tighten. Dr. Park, this patient is having a neurological emergency. Insurance status is irrelevant when someone's brain is swelling. I understand, but we need to document our attempts to obtain financial information. Hospital policy. Hospital policy also requires us to provide emergency care regardless of ability to pay, Maya replied, her voice steady but firm. This man, you could die while we're discussing paperwork. The tension in the room was palpable. Maya had just challenged the unspoken hierarchy that often prioritized financial considerations over patient care. Several staff members exchanged glances, some supportive, others uncomfortable with the confrontation. Dr. Rodriguez stepped in diplomatically. Dr. Park, we'll handle the financial aspects after we stabilize the patient. Right now, medical necessity takes precedence. As the mannitol began to work, the patient's vital signs stabilized slightly, but Maya knew they were still in critical territory. She performed another neurological assessment, noting that his pupils remained sluggish and his motor responses were minimal. Time was running out. The CT scanner is ready, announced a radiology technician who had appeared in the doorway. As they prepared to transport the patient, Maya caught Jennifer's eye. This is what we signed up for, she said quietly. Sometimes being a nurse means fighting for patients who can't fight for themselves. Jennifer nodded, but Maya could see the uncertainty in her expression. The young nurse was learning that medical care wasn't just about clinical skills. It was about navigating complex social dynamics, institutional pressures, and personal biases that could affect patient outcomes. As they wheeled the patient toward radiology, Maya noticed the security guard from the lobby watching them pass. His expression was one she'd seen countless times, skepticism mixed with resignation. Another John Doe, another problem for the system to handle, another reminder that the emergency department served as society's safety net for people no one else wanted to deal with. But Maya saw something different when she looked at their patient. Beneath the expensive clothing and mysterious circumstances, she saw a human being whose life hung in the balance. Someone who had collapsed alone on a city street while crowds of people walked past, too busy or too frightened or too indifferent to stop and help. The CT scanner hummed to life as they positioned the patient on the table. Within minutes, Maya would know whether her instincts were correct, whether this well-dressed stranger was facing a life-threatening brain injury that required immediate surgical intervention. What she didn't know was that the man lying unconscious before her controlled a business empire that employed over 200,000 people worldwide. She didn't know about the emergency board meeting that had been called when he failed to appear for the merger signing, or the private investigators already being hired to locate him. All Maya knew was that someone needed her help, and she was determined to provide it, regardless of who he was or where he came from. In her world, every life had equal value, and every patient deserved the same level of care and compassion. The CT images would soon reveal the true extent of his condition, but the real test was just beginning, not just of his chances for survival, but of the hospital's commitment to treating all patients with dignity and respect, regardless of their apparent social status. The CT images appeared on the screen like ghostly cross-sections of a human mind in crisis. Maya stood beside Dr. Rodriguez in the radiology reading room, her heart sinking as the black and white pictures revealed what she had feared most. A massive subdural hematoma was clearly visible on the left side of the patient's brain. Dark, blood pooling between his skull and brain tissue, creating pressure that threatened to destroy vital neural pathways with each passing minute. Jesus, Dr. Rodriguez muttered under his breath, pointing to the screen. That's at least a 4-centimeter bleed, and look at the midline shift. His brain is being pushed completely off-center. Maya traced the ominous shadow with her finger, calculating in her mind how much time they had before irreversible damage occurred. The bleeding probably started during his initial seizure when his head hit the curb. He's been walking around with this building pressure for over an hour now. Dr. Jennifer Hawkins, the neurosurgeon on call, arrived within minutes of being paged. She was a brilliant surgeon with 15 years of experience, but Maya noticed the slight hesitation in her demeanor as she studied the scans alongside the team. Dr. Hawkins had built her reputation on successful outcomes and taking on a high-risk surgery for an unidentified patient with no insurance verification was the kind of case that could damage statistics and career trajectories. The bleed is significant, Dr. Hawkins said carefully, but the patient has no medical history available, no family to consent to surgery, and no insurance pre-authorization. This is a complex situation. Maya felt something ignite inside her chest, a familiar fire that burned whenever she witnessed the gap between what medicine could do and what institutions were willing to do. Dr. Hawkins, this patient will die without immediate surgical intervention. We're not talking about elective surgery here. This is a life-threatening emergency. I understand that, Maya, but there are protocols we need to follow. Without family consent, we need administrative approval for major surgery, especially for an unidentified patient. The hospital assumes significant liability in cases like this. Maya looked back at the monitor displaying their patient's vital signs. His intracranial pressure was continuing to rise despite the mannitol, and his neurological responses were declining. Each minute they spent discussing protocols was a minute closer to permanent brain damage or death. How long will administrative approval take? Maya asked, though she already knew the answer would be unacceptable. Dr. Park, who had followed them to radiology, consulted her tablet. Given that it's evening shift, we'd need to reach the chief medical officer at home. Could be anywhere from 2 to 4 hours, depending on whether we can reach him immediately. This patient doesn't have 4 hours, Maya said, her voice rising slightly. "He doesn't have 2 hours. Look at these pressure readings. His brain is being crushed while we debate paperwork." The room fell silent, except for the humming of medical equipment. Maya realized that everyone was looking at her, waiting to see how far she would push this confrontation. In the hierarchy of hospital politics, nurses were expected to advocate for patients within certain boundaries. She was approaching the line where advocacy became insubordination. Dr. Rodriguez cleared his throat diplomatically. "Maya, I understand your concerns, but Dr. Hawkins is right about the legal complications. If this patient has a family who might object to surgery, or if there are advanced directives we're not aware of, the hospital could face serious liability." Maya turned to face the group, her mind racing through everything she'd observed about their patient. The expensive clothing, the manicured hands, the high-quality watch, the fact that he'd been found in the financial district rather than in an area where indigent patients typically collapsed. None of it added up to someone without resources or family. "I want to try something," Maya said suddenly. "Give me 15 minutes before we make any irreversible decisions about waiting for administrative approval." Dr. Hawkins frowned. "What are you thinking?" This man was found in downtown Chicago, wearing a $3,000 suit. He's clearly not homeless or indigent. Someone is looking for him. Someone knows who he is. If I can identify him in the next 15 minutes, we can contact his family or his employer for consent and insurance information. It was a long shot, and everyone in the room knew it. But Maya had learned to trust her instincts, and every instinct she had was screaming that this patient was more than he appeared to be. "Dr. Rodriguez, can you keep him stable for 15 minutes while I investigate?" Dr. Rodriguez looked uncertain. "Maya, how exactly do you plan to identify an unconscious patient with no ID?" Maya was already moving toward the door. His phone. The paramedic said his phone was found with him. Even if it's locked, there might be emergency contact information or recent calls that could tell us who he is. She found the patient's personal effects in a plastic bag at the nurse's station. The phone was indeed locked, but Maya noticed it was an expensive model with emergency contact features. She pressed the emergency button and a screen appeared, showing emergency contacts and medical ID. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the medical ID section. The information that appeared made her heart skip a beat. Name, Michael Harrison, age, 44. Emergency contact, Rebecca Harrison, wife, 312. 555-0147. Secondary contact, Harrison Industries Security, 312-555-0200. Medical conditions, epilepsy. Controlled medications, phenytoin, 300 milliliters daily. Allergies. Penicillin. Maya stared at the screen for a moment, processing the implications. This wasn't just any patient. This was Michael Harrison, CEO of Harrison Industries, one of the largest technology companies in the world. She'd seen his face on magazine covers, heard his name mentioned in news reports about major business, deals and technological innovations. But more importantly, the medical ID explained everything. He had epilepsy, which meant his seizure wasn't caused by the head injury. The head injury was caused by the seizure. He'd probably felt an aura warning him about the impending seizure, tried to get out of his car safely, but the seizure had struck before he could reach safety. The subdural hematoma was a secondary injury from hitting the curb during the seizure. Maya rushed back to radiology, her mind racing with the new information. "I know who he is," she announced as she burst through the door. "His name is Michael Harrison. He's the CEO of Harrison Industries, and he has a history of epilepsy." The effect on the room was immediate and dramatic. Dr. Hawkins straightened up, suddenly much more attentive. Dr. Park began typing rapidly on her tablet, probably looking up Harrison Industries' insurance information. Even Dr. Rodriguez's demeanor shifted, becoming more focused and urgent. "Are you certain?" Dr. Hawkins asked. Maya showed them the medical ID screen. His emergency contacts are listed, including his wife and corporate security. And look, he has a history of epilepsy controlled with medication. This explains the seizure pattern and the prolonged postictal state. Dr. Park looked up from her tablet, her eyes wide. Harrison Industries has platinum-level corporate insurance with us. They're one of our largest corporate accounts. This changes everything. Maya felt a mixture of relief and disgust. Relief that the patient would now receive the immediate care he needed. Disgust that his identity and insurance status had suddenly made him worthy of urgent attention when his medical condition alone should have been sufficient. Dr. Hawkins, can we proceed with surgery now? Maya asked. Absolutely. I'll prepare for an immediate craniotomy. Maya, call his emergency contacts while I get ready. As the surgical team mobilized with newfound urgency, Maya placed the call to Rebecca Harrison. The phone rang twice before a worried voice answered. Hello? Who is this? Mrs. Harrison, this is Maya Johnson, a nurse at Chicago Metropolitan Hospital. Your husband Michael has been in an accident. He had a seizure and sustained a head injury. He's alive, but he needs emergency brain surgery. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds before Rebecca Harrison's voice returned, shaky but determined. I'm coming right now. Please take care of him. Is he going to be okay? We're doing everything we can, Mrs. Harrison. He's in excellent hands with our neurosurgical team. After ending the call, Maya returned to Michael Harrison's bedside. He looked exactly the same as he had when the paramedics brought him in, unconscious, vulnerable, dependent on the skills and compassion of strangers, but the entire atmosphere around him had transformed. Where before there had been hesitation and bureaucratic obstacles, now there was focused urgency and unlimited resources. Jennifer Walsh approached her station, confusion evident on her face. Maya, I don't understand. Why is everyone suddenly moving so quickly? What changed? Maya looked at the young nurse, seeing in her face the same questions she'd been asking herself throughout her career. What changed, Jennifer, is that we found out who he is, and apparently that matters more than it should. But his medical condition is exactly the same as it was 20 minutes ago. Exactly, Maya said quietly. That's the problem. As they prepared to transfer Michael Harrison to the operating room, Maya reflected on the past hour. Her decision to take 15 minutes to identify him had literally saved his life, but it had also exposed uncomfortable truths about how medical care was actually delivered in America. A billionaire CEO received immediate attention once his identity was known, while countless unnamed patients received delayed or inferior care every day. Dr. Hawkins appeared in surgical scrubs, her entire demeanor now radiating confidence and determination. Maya, thank you for identifying him. That additional medical history about his epilepsy completely changes our surgical approach. We're dealing with a breakthrough seizure that caused trauma, not a traumatic brain injury that caused seizures. Maya nodded. But she couldn't shake the feeling that Dr. Hawkins's newfound enthusiasm had less to do with the medical history and more to do with the patient's identity. Still, she was grateful that Michael Harrison would receive the expert care he needed to survive. As they wheeled him towards surgery, Maya caught sight of herself in the reflection of the elevator doors. She had made a choice to fight for this patient when others were ready to let bureaucracy determine his fate. She had trusted her instincts, pursued the truth, and ultimately saved a life. But the victory felt complicated. She wondered how many other patients without famous names or platinum insurance, had died while hospitals debated protocols and liability. She wondered what would have happened to Michael Harrison if she hadn't pushed to identify him, if she had simply accepted the system's initial reluctance to act. The elevator doors closed, carrying Michael Harrison towards surgery, and, hopefully, toward recovery. Maya watched the floor numbers climb, knowing that in a few hours she would learn whether her decision to fight for him had been enough to save his life. What she didn't yet know was that this case would change not only Michael Harrison's life, but her own, and ultimately challenge the entire healthcare system to confront its own biases about who deserved immediate, compassionate care and who could wait. The operating room fell into the familiar rhythm of a life-saving procedure as Dr. Hawkins made the first incision. Maya had volunteered to stay late, coordinating with the intensive care unit to prepare for Michael Harrison's post-operative care. Through the observation window, she watched the surgical team work with precision, removing pieces of skull to access the bleeding that threatened his brain. 3 hours into the surgery, Rebecca Harrison arrived at the hospital with an entourage that transformed the quiet evening atmosphere. Corporate security personnel, personal assistants, and what appeared to be a team of private physicians filled the family waiting area. Maya noticed how quickly the hospital administration materialized. Executives who rarely appeared during evening shifts suddenly became very present and attentive. Rebecca Harrison was a composed woman in her early 40s, her designer clothes and confident bearing marking her as someone accustomed to having problems solved quickly and efficiently. But beneath the polished exterior, Maya could see the raw fear that came with watching someone you love fight for their life. "Mrs. Harrison, I'm Maya Johnson, the nurse who's been coordinating your husband's care," Maya introduced herself, approaching the family area. Rebecca's eyes showed immediate recognition. "You're the one who called me. Thank you for finding his phone, for identifying him. The doctors told me that delay in surgery could have—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "Your husband is in excellent hands," Maya assured her. "Dr. Hawkins is one of the best neurosurgeons in the country. The surgery is progressing well." What Maya didn't say was how different the atmosphere had become once Michael Harrison's identity was known. The same Dr. Hawkins who had been reluctant to operate without administrative approval was now pulling out every advanced technique in her arsenal. Additional specialists had been called in for consultation. The hospital's most experienced surgical nurses had been reassigned to assist with the procedure. Maya found herself torn between relief that Michael was receiving optimal care and frustration at the disparity she witnessed daily. In bed 18, just down the hall, an elderly homeless man named Robert was recovering from a similar head injury, with a fraction of the resources now being devoted to Michael Harrison. Robert's surgery had been delayed for 6 hours while they tried to locate a neurosurgeon willing to operate pro bono. Dr. Rodriguez found Maya reviewing charts at the nurse's station around midnight. "Maya, you should go home. You've been here for 14 hours. "I want to see him through recovery," Maya replied. "Mrs. Harrison has questions about his epilepsy management, and I'm the only one here who took the time to read his complete medical history." It was true. Once Michael's identity had been established, everyone focused on the dramatic brain surgery, but Maya had spent time researching his epilepsy history. His medical records, now accessible through the hospital's VIP patient protocol, revealed a complex neurological condition that had been well controlled for years until a recent medication change. His neurologist switched his anti-seizure medication 6 weeks ago, Maya explained to Dr. Rodriguez. The new drug has a longer half-life, but requires different timing. Based on his blood levels, I think he missed a dose yesterday, which lowered his seizure threshold. Dr. Rodriguez looked impressed. "How did you figure that out?" I called his neurologist's office and spoke to the nurse practitioner. She confirmed that Michael had been having breakthrough seizures since the medication change, but he'd been ignoring the warnings because of work stress. The merger he was working on was apparently the biggest deal of his career. This attention to detail was typical of Maya's approach to patient care. While others focused on the immediate crisis, she tried to understand the complete picture of what had brought someone to their bedside. In Michael's case, it painted a picture of a man so driven by professional obligations that he'd ignored his body's warning signs. Around 2 a.m., Dr. Hawkins emerged from surgery, her scrubs stained with the evidence of the delicate work she'd performed. Maya accompanied her to the family waiting area, where Rebecca Harrison stood up with barely contained anxiety. "The surgery was successful," Dr. Hawkins announced. "We were able to remove all of the blood clot and repair the damaged blood vessels. His brain pressure has normalized, and we don't anticipate any permanent neurological damage." Rebecca Harrison's legs nearly gave out with relief. Maya stepped forward to steady her, guiding her to a chair. "Can I see him?" Rebecca asked. "He's being transferred to the intensive care unit now," Dr. Hawkins explained. "He'll be sedated for the next 24 to 48 hours while his brain heals. But his vital signs are strong, and his response to stimuli during surgery was encouraging." As the family processed this information, Maya noticed the small army of corporate representatives already planning the next steps. Phone calls were being made to arrange private room accommodations, specialized nurses, and additional security. The machinery of wealth and influence was smoothly taking over Michael Harrison's care. Over the next 3 days, Maya found herself serving as an unofficial liaison between the Harrison family and the medical team. Rebecca had specifically requested that Maya remain involved in her husband's care, recognizing that the nurse who had fought to identify him in those crucial first hours had a deeper understanding of his case than anyone else. Maya watched as Michael slowly emerged from sedation. His first words were confused questions about where he was and what had happened. She sat beside his bed, explaining gently that he'd had a seizure, hit his head, and required emergency surgery. His memory of the events leading up to the seizure was fragmentary. He remembered feeling the familiar aura symptoms while driving, remembered trying to get out of his car safely, but everything after that was blank. "The merger," he whispered. On his 3rd day awake, his voice still weak but urgent. "The Japanese investors, what happened to the deal?" Rebecca took his hand. "Michael, you nearly died. The deal can wait." But Maya could see the anxiety in his eyes. She had learned enough about his medical history to understand that stress was a significant trigger for his seizures. The pressure he put on himself, the inability to delegate important decisions, the tendency to work through illness, all of these factors had contributed to his current situation. "Mr. Harrison," Maya said gently, "your neurologist wants to talk to you about managing your epilepsy differently. The seizure you had wasn't random. It was your body telling you that something needed to change." During his recovery, Maya observed the stark contrasts in how different patients were treated. Michael's room was filled with flowers, cards from world leaders, and technology executives. A team of private nurses attended to his every need. His meals were prepared by the hospital's executive chef. Every test was expedited. Every specialist consultation was arranged within hours. Meanwhile, in the regular ward, Maya continued to care for patients who waited days for basic tests, who received minimal attention from overworked staff, who were discharged too early because their insurance wouldn't cover extended stays. The disparity was so pronounced that it became impossible to ignore. Jennifer Walsh, still learning the ropes, asked Maya about the difference one evening. "Why does Mr. Harrison get so much attention? I mean, I understand he's important, but doesn't every patient deserve the same level of care?" Maya paused her charting to consider the question. "You're right, Jennifer. Every patient does deserve the same level of care. The fact that they don't get it is one of the hardest parts of this job." "Then why do we accept it?" It was a question Maya had been asking herself for 15 years. Because fighting the system is exhausting, and most of the time we lose. But sometimes Like with Mr. Harrison, we can make a difference for one person, and sometimes one case changes how people think about all the others. On Michael's fourth day in the ICU, Maya noticed him watching her work with other patients. She was adjusting the position of an elderly woman in the next bed, taking time to make sure she was comfortable, despite the fact that the woman couldn't afford a private room or specialized nursing care. "You do that for everyone, don't you?" Michael asked when Maya returned to check his neurological responses. "Do what?" "Treat every patient like they matter." Maya looked at him carefully. "Every patient does matter, Mr. Harrison. The system doesn't always reflect that, but it doesn't change the truth." Michael was quiet for a long moment. "I remember lying on that sidewalk, hearing people walk past. I remember thinking that no one was going to help me, that I was going to die alone surrounded by strangers who didn't care." "But someone did help you," Maya pointed out. "The paramedics came. We treated you. Dr. Hawkins saved your life. Only after you figured out who I was. Only after you made them care." Maya felt uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "I would have fought just as hard for any patient in your condition." "I believe that," Michael said. "But would everyone else have?" The question hung in the air between them, unanswered but understood. Michael Harrison was beginning to see the healthcare system from a perspective he'd never experienced before, as someone vulnerable, dependent, and initially deemed unworthy of immediate attention. As Maya prepared to end her shift, she realized that this case had changed her as much as it had changed Michael Harrison. She had always known that healthcare was imperfect, that resources were limited, that some patients received better treatment than others, but seeing the dramatic difference in response before and after Michael's identification had crystallized her understanding of just how broken the system really was. The man who controlled billions of dollars and employed hundreds of thousands of people was learning what it felt like to be invisible, while the nurse who had saved his life was wondering whether her individual acts of compassion were enough to address the systemic problems she witnessed every day. On Michael Harrison's 7th day in the hospital, something shifted. Maya arrived for her morning shift to find him sitting up in bed, no longer connected to the intensive monitoring equipment that had tracked his every heartbeat for the past week. His color had returned, his speech was clear, and the confused fog that had clouded his eyes since the surgery was finally lifting. But there was something else different about him, a quality of attention that Maya hadn't seen before. He watched everything that happened in the ICU with the focused intensity of someone who was truly seeing his surroundings for the first time. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison," Maya said as she began her routine neurological assessment. "How are you? You feeling today?" "Like I'm waking up from more than just a medical emergency," he replied, his voice thoughtful. "Maya, can I ask you something?" She nodded as she checked his pupil responses and motor function. "That first night, when I was brought in, before anyone knew who I was, what would have happened to me?" Maya paused in her assessment, meeting his gaze directly. It was a question she'd been dreading, because answering it honestly would mean acknowledging truths that most people preferred to ignore. "You would have received medical care," she said carefully. "But would I have received the same medical care?" The directness of his question caught her off guard. Most patients, especially wealthy patients, preferred comfortable illusions about healthcare equality. They wanted to believe that their privileged treatment was simply the result of good insurance or coincidence, not systematic bias. "Mr. Harrison, I'm not sure this is a conversation you want to have while you're still recovering. I'm not recovering from brain surgery to go back to being ignorant about how the world actually works," he said firmly. "I need to know, would I have died if you hadn't identified me?" Maya looked around the ICU, noting which staff members were within earshot. This was dangerous territory, criticizing hospital protocols or suggesting that patient care varied. based on social status, could have serious consequences for her career. The medical outcome would have been the same, she said finally, but the timeline might have been different. How different? Maya sat down in the chair beside his bed, abandoning her usual professional distance. The neurosurgeon wanted to wait for administrative approval before operating. That could have taken 2 to 4 hours. Your brain bleed was severe enough that any significant delay... She didn't need to finish the sentence. Michael understood that he would have died while hospital administrators debated liability and insurance coverage for an unidentified patient. "So you saved my life twice," he said quietly. "Once by pushing for immediate treatment, and once by figuring out who I was. I was just doing my job." "No," Michael said, shaking his head. "I've been lying here for a week watching you work. I've seen you with the patients who don't have private rooms, who don't have teams of specialists, who don't have families calling every hour to check on their care. You do the same thing for all of them that you did for me. That's not standard. Protocol. That's who you are." Maya felt uncomfortable with the praise, but also recognized that something important was happening in this conversation. Michael Harrison wasn't just recovering from brain surgery. He was processing a fundamental shift in his understanding of how society worked. "Mr. Harrison, you're one of the most powerful people in the world. You employ hundreds of thousands of people. You influence global markets. You have access to resources that most people can't imagine. But for about an hour that first night, you were just another John Doe lying unconscious on a gurney, completely dependent on the kindness of strangers." Michael was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the Chicago skyline where his corporate headquarters dominated the horizon. "Do you know what I was doing when I had the seizure?" Maya shook her head. "I was on my way to sign a merger agreement that would have created the largest technology company in human history. $47 billion. I was thinking about market dominance, about shareholder value, about beating our competitors. I was so focused on the deal that I ignored my neurologist's warnings about my medication, ignored the breakthrough seizures. I'd been ignored every signal my body was sending me." He turned back to face Maya. "I was literally willing to risk my life for a business deal, and when I actually did collapse, when I was dying on that sidewalk, not one person stopped to help me. They saw an expensive suit and assumed someone else would handle it, or they saw a medical emergency and decided it wasn't their problem." Maya watched as tears began to form in his eyes, the first genuine emotion she'd seen from him since he'd regained consciousness. "Do you know what I kept thinking about while I was lying there?" he continued. "I kept thinking about all the board meetings where we discussed healthcare benefits for our employees. All the time, we chose cheaper insurance plans to improve our profit margins. All the decisions I made that affected people's access to medical care, and I made them from boardrooms where no one ever had to choose between rent money and prescription medications." The weight of his realization was becoming clear to Maya. Michael Harrison wasn't just confronting his own mortality, he was confronting the moral implications of the power he wielded. "There's a man in bed 12, Maya said gently. "Robert, Washington. He's 68 years old, homeless for the past 3 years since he lost his job in manufacturing. He had a head injury similar to yours, but his surgery was delayed for 6 hours because we couldn't find a neurosurgeon willing to operate without guaranteed payment. He survived, but he has permanent cognitive damage that could have been prevented." Michael's face darkened. "What company did he work for?" "A parts supplier for Harrison Industries. They closed the factory and moved production overseas in 2020. The silence that followed was deafening. Maya watched as Michael processed the connection between his corporate decisions and the human consequences lying just down the hall from his private room. "I want to meet him," Michael said suddenly. "Mr. Harrison, I don't think that's appropriate right now. You're still recovering, and Robert isn't in good condition for visitors." "Please," Michael said, his voice breaking slightly. I need to see him. I need to understand what my decisions actually cost. Against her better judgment, Maya agreed to arrange the meeting. That afternoon, she wheeled Michael in a wheelchair to Robert's bedside. The contrast was stark. Michael in his hospital-provided pajamas, but still obviously well cared for. Robert in a standard hospital gown, connected to basic monitoring equipment, alone except for the occasional nursing check. Robert was awake, but confused, the result of his delayed surgery. He looked at Michael without recognition, his damaged brain struggling to process the presence of visitors. Robert, Maya said gently, this is Michael. He wanted to meet you. Robert smiled with the innocent friendliness of someone whose cognitive damage had stripped away social barriers. Hello, Michael, are you hurt too? Michael's composure finally broke. Tears streamed down his face as he reached out to take Robert's hand. Yes, Robert, I'm hurt too, but I'm going to get better, and I'm going to make sure you get better too. Maya watched this exchange with growing amazement. She had seen many patients experience life-changing revelations during their recovery, but nothing quite like this. Michael Harrison was undergoing a complete transformation of his understanding of power, responsibility, and human dignity. Maya, Michael said as they returned to his room, I want to do something. I want to change how this works. Mr. Harrison, you're still recovering from major brain surgery. You don't need to make any big decisions right now. This isn't a decision, he said firmly. This is a recognition. I've spent my entire career optimizing systems for efficiency and profit. But I never considered that healthcare isn't supposed to be a system that sorts people into worthy and unworthy categories. It's supposed to be a system that treats everyone like they matter. That evening, Rebecca Harrison found Maya at the nurse's station. I wanted to thank you for whatever you said to my husband today. He's been different since your conversation. More present, more engaged, but also more determined about something. He's processing a lot right now, Maya said carefully. Near-death experiences often lead people to re-evaluate their priorities. Michael told me he wants to establish a foundation focused on healthcare equity. He's talking about using our resources to ensure that every patient gets the same level of care he received, regardless of their ability to pay. Maya felt a spark of hope mixed with skepticism. She'd seen wealthy patients make grand promises during medical crises, only to return to their old patterns once the immediate danger passed. That would be wonderful, Mrs. Harrison. Healthcare disparities are a real problem that affects millions of people. He also said he wants you to run. Maya stopped what she was doing, staring at Rebecca in shock. I'm sorry, what? The foundation. He wants you to be the director. He says you're the only person he trusts to make sure it actually accomplishes what it's supposed to accomplish, instead of just making us feel better about ourselves. Maya looked across the ICU at Michael's room, where she could see him reading. On his tablet, probably researching healthcare policy and foundation structures with the same intensity he'd once brought to merger negotiations. Mrs. Harrison, I'm a nurse. I don't know anything about running foundations or managing large-scale social programs. But you know about caring for people when no one else will. According to my husband, that's the most important qualification there is. As Maya processed this unexpected turn of events, she realized that the case that had begun with a seizure on a downtown sidewalk was about to become something much larger. Michael Harrison's transformation from a profit-focused CEO to a healthcare equity advocate was just the beginning of a story that would ultimately challenge the entire system to live up to its promise of providing healing and hope to everyone who needed it. 6 months after Michael Harrison walked out of Chicago Metropolitan Hospital with a fresh scar hidden beneath his carefully styled hair, the world looked fundamentally different through his eyes. The Harrison Foundation for Healthcare Equity had officially launched with an initial endowment of $2 billion, making it one of the largest private healthcare foundations in American history. But more importantly, it was already changing lives in ways that quarterly reports and board meetings could never capture. Maya Johnson stood in the foundation's new headquarters, a renovated building in Chicago's South Side that had once housed a shuttered community health clinic. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone, taking a space where healthcare had been abandoned and transforming it into a center for healthcare innovation and advocacy. Through the large windows, she could see the neighborhood where she'd grown up, where medical emergencies still meant long waits and difficult choices between rent money and prescription medications. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of learning, growing, and occasionally feeling completely overwhelmed by the scope of what they were trying to accomplish. Maya had taken a leave of absence from the hospital to develop the foundation's programs, though she still worked shifts in the emergency department twice a month to stay connected to the front lines of patient care. Maya, the board meeting is, starting in 5 minutes, called Jennifer Walsh, who had followed Maya from the hospital to become the foundation's director of clinical programs. The young nurse had proven to have exceptional organizational skills and an intuitive understanding of how to translate bedside nursing experience into policy recommendations. The boardroom was unlike any corporate space Maya had ever seen. Instead of the typical long table with leather chairs, Michael had insisted on a circular arrangement that put everyone at equal level. The walls were covered with patient stories, photographs from community health clinics, and data visualizations showing healthcare disparities across different populations. It was a room designed to keep the human impact of their work at the center of every decision. Michael entered the room looking healthier than Maya had seen him since before his seizure. His medication was properly adjusted, his stress levels were significantly reduced, and he had learned to delegate responsibilities in ways that allowed him to focus on the work that truly mattered to him. The driven CEO was still there, but now his drive was focused on equity rather than market dominance. Before we start with the quarterly updates, Michael began, I want to share something that happened yesterday. Maya, would you tell them about the call from Detroit? Maya stood consulting her notes. Yesterday, we received a call from Detroit Metropolitan Hospital. They had a patient, a 34-year-old woman named Sandra Martinez, who was brought in unconscious after a diabetic emergency. She had no ID, no insurance card, no family with her. The emergency department was preparing to stabilize her and transfer her to the county hospital when one of the nurses remembered our rapid response protocol. The rapid response protocol was one of the Foundation's first innovations, a system that allowed hospitals to immediately access emergency funding for uninsured patients while simultaneously conducting outreach to identify them and connect them with long-term resources. Within 2 hours, we had identified Sandra, contacted her family, arranged for her insulin and glucose monitoring supplies, and connected her with a diabetes educator who speaks Spanish, Maya continued. But more importantly, we prevented her from being transferred to an overcrowded county hospital where she would have received minimal follow-up care. Board member Dr. Patricia Williams, a primary care physician from the West Side, raised her hand. How many similar interventions have we funded this quarter? Jennifer consulted her tablet. 437 direct patient interventions, with an average cost of $1,200 per case. But the follow-up surveys show that 91% of those patients are now connected to ongoing primary care, compared to 32% who typically follow up after emergency department visits without intervention. The numbers were impressive, but Maya knew the real measure of their success was in the individual stories. Like Robert Washington, the homeless man who had been in the bed next to Michael during his recovery. The foundation had arranged for Robert's continued neurological care, helped him secure stable housing, and connected him with vocational rehabilitation services. 6 months later, Robert was working part-time at the Foundation's community outreach center, using his own experience to help other patients navigate the healthcare system. Maya, tell them about the nursing scholarship program, Michael prompted. Maya smiled, thinking about one of her favorite initiatives. We've partnered with 4 nursing schools to provide full scholarships for students who commit to working in underserved communities after graduation. But beyond just funding their education, we're also providing mentorship, clinical rotations in our partner hospitals, and ongoing support throughout their careers. The first cohort of Harrison Foundation nursing scholars was already making an impact. 25 students from backgrounds similar to Maya's own were learning not just clinical skills, but also advocacy, cultural competency, and systems thinking. They were being trained to see healthcare disparities as problems to be solved, not simply accepted. Dr. James Rodriguez, a health policy expert who had joined the board, leaned forward. The scholarship program is excellent, but I'm curious about the policy work. Are we making progress on the systemic issues that created these problems in the first place? This was the aspect of the Foundation's work that Maya found most challenging, but also most necessary. Helping individual patients was important, but changing the underlying systems that created disparities required a different set of skills and strategies. We've been working with state legislators on 3 pieces of legislation, Maya explained. First, a bill that would require hospitals to maintain emergency financial assistance programs with standardized criteria and application processes. Second, legislation that would establish minimum staffing ratios for nurses in emergency departments and intensive care units. Third, a bill that would require insurance companies to provide real-time authorization for emergency procedures. Michael added, we're also working with other major employers in the region to establish healthcare benefit standards that ensure all employees have access to the same quality of care, regardless of their position in the company hierarchy. The conversation turned to the Foundation's research initiatives, which were producing data that couldn't be ignored. A study of emergency department wait times had revealed that patients with Medicaid insurance waited an average of 43 minutes, longer for initial assessment than patients with private insurance, even when controlling for the severity of their conditions. Another study found that Black and Hispanic patients were significantly less likely to receive adequate pain management in emergency departments, a disparity that persisted even when the treating physicians were aware of the research. The most important thing we're learning, Maya said, is that healthcare disparities aren't just about insurance coverage or access to facilities. They're about unconscious bias, institutional racism, and systems that were designed to serve some people better than others. Board member Sarah Kim, a hospital administrator, nodded thoughtfully. That's why the implicit bias training we're developing is so important. But Maya, how do we measure whether we're actually changing minds and behaviors, not just checking boxes? It was a crucial question that Maya wrestled with daily. We're tracking patient satisfaction scores, complaint patterns, and clinical outcomes across different demographic groups in our partner hospitals. But we're also doing something more innovative. We're training patients and families to be advocates for themselves and to document their experiences. The Patient Voice Initiative was perhaps Maya's proudest innovation, working with community organizations, The foundation trained individuals from underserved communities to observe and document their healthcare experiences, creating a database of patient perspectives that could identify problems and track improvements over time. Last month, we received a report from one of our patient voice advocates about a pattern of discrimination in a suburban emergency department, Maya explained. Latino patients were consistently being asked for immigration documents before receiving care, which is illegal but was happening routinely. We were able to work with hospital administration to address the problem immediately. Michael stood up and walked to the window overlooking the South Side neighborhood. 6 months ago, I was lying unconscious on a sidewalk while people walked past me. I was experiencing what millions of people experience every day. Being invisible, to a system that's supposed to care for everyone. He turned back to the group. Maya saw me when no one else would. She fought for me when the system was ready to let me wait. And now, we're trying to make sure that every patient has someone, like Maya, fighting for them. Maya felt the familiar mixture of pride and overwhelming responsibility that came with this work. The truth is, we can't train enough nurses or hire enough advocates to solve this problem person by person. We have to change the culture of healthcare so that every medical professional naturally sees every patient as worthy of their best effort. Jennifer raised her hand. I have an idea about that. What if we created a recognition program for healthcare workers who demonstrate exceptional advocacy for underserved patients? Not just an award, but real financial incentives and career advancement opportunities? The idea sparked immediate interest around the table. Maya could see the possibilities, transforming healthcare culture by rewarding the behaviors they wanted to see more of, rather than just talking about them. I love that idea, said Dr. Williams. We could partner with medical schools and nursing programs to make advocacy and cultural competency a bigger part of the curriculum. Students who demonstrate these skills could be fast-tracked for scholarships or residency programs. As the meeting continued, Maya found herself thinking about the ripple effects of that night 6 months ago. Michael's seizure had exposed the fault lines in American healthcare, but it had also created an opportunity to begin healing those fractures. The foundation was just one response to a massive problem, but it was proving that change was possible when people with resources decided to use them for justice rather than just profit. After the meeting, Maya and Michael walked through the foundation's community clinic, which provided primary care, mental health services, and health education to neighborhood residents. The waiting room was full, but not chaotic. Patients were seen promptly, treated with dignity, and connected to resources they needed for ongoing health maintenance. Maya, can I ask you something? Michael said, as they observed a nurse practitioner patiently explaining diabetes management to an elderly patient in Spanish. Of course. Do you ever regret leaving hospital nursing for this work? Maya considered the question. Sometimes I miss the immediacy of emergency nursing, the feeling of saving someone's life in the moment. But this work is about saving lives too, just over a longer timeline and on a larger scale. They stopped in front of a photo wall showing some of the patients who had been helped by foundation programs. Sandra Martinez, the diabetic woman from Detroit, was there with her family. Robert Washington was smiling beside his new co-workers at the Community Outreach Center. There were dozens of other faces, people who had received emergency care without delay, who had been connected to specialists they couldn't otherwise afford, who had been treated with dignity when they were most vulnerable. I keep thinking about that night, Michael said quietly. About lying on that sidewalk, hearing footsteps walking past. I was literally dying, and people couldn't be bothered to stop. But you stopped. You fought for me, and now look what's happened. Maya looked around the clinic, bustling with healthcare. Workers who had been trained in cultural competency and patient advocacy, serving patients who were receiving the same quality of care regardless of their ability to pay. Michael, what happened to you could happen to anyone. A medical emergency, a moment of vulnerability, a system that might or might not be there when you need it. The only difference is that most people don't have the resources to build a foundation afterward. That's exactly why we had to build it, Michael replied, because everyone deserves to have someone fight for them the way you fought for me. As Maya prepared to leave that evening, she stopped by the emergency department at Chicago Metropolitan Hospital to pick up some files. The evening shift was just beginning, and she recognized many of the faces from her own years working those halls. Dr. Rodriguez approached her with a smile. "Maya, how's the foundation working treating you?" "It's challenging, but rewarding." "How? Are things here?" "Actually better than they've been in years. The rapid response protocol you developed has eliminated most of our delays for uninsured patients. And the bias training the foundation provided has really changed how we approach patient care." Maya noticed a familiar figure at the nurse's station, Jennifer Walsh, working her monthly shift to stay connected to clinical practice. She was training a new graduate nurse, just as Maya had once trained her. "The most important thing to remember," Maya heard Jennifer telling the new nurse, "is that everyone who comes through those doors is someone's whole world. That homeless man in bed 3, someone loved him once. That teenager with the overdose, her parents are probably praying for her recovery right now." Maya smiled, recognizing her own words from that night 6 months ago when she had been training. "Jennifer, the lessons were being passed on, the culture was changing, one nurse and one patient at a time." As she walked through the hospital corridors toward the exit, Maya reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. A single night, a single decision to fight for a patient who couldn't fight for himself had created ripple effects that were still expanding. Thousands of patients were receiving better care. Hundreds of healthcare workers were being trained in advocacy and cultural competency, and the conversation about healthcare equity was happening in boardrooms and legislative chambers across the country. The automatic doors opened as she approached, and Maya stepped out into the Chicago evening. Somewhere in the city, there were people having medical emergencies, facing the vulnerability and fear that came with sudden illness or injury. But because of the work that had begun with Michael Harrison's Seizure, more of them would find advocates, ready to fight for them, systems designed to serve them with dignity, and a healthcare culture that recognized the worth of every human life. Maya pulled out her phone and saw a text message from Michael. "Board meeting went well today. Thank you for everything you do and everything you've taught me about what really matters. The Foundation Board approved funding for the advocacy training program in 12 more hospitals. We're changing the world, one patient at a time." Maya smiled as she typed her response. "That's what we signed up for. See you tomorrow." As she walked toward her car, Maya thought about all the patients she'd cared for over the years, all the times she'd fought against systemic barriers to get people the care they needed. Some battles she'd won, some she'd lost, but each one had prepared her for this larger fight against the inequities that plagued American healthcare. The work was far from finished. Healthcare disparities still existed, unconscious bias still affected patient care, and economic barriers still prevented millions of people from accessing the medical services they needed. But change was happening, one hospital at a time, one healthcare worker at a time, one patient at a time, and it had all started with a nurse who refused to walk past someone who needed help, even when everyone else had decided he wasn't worth stopping for. Sometimes Maya realized changing the world really was as simple as treating every person like they mattered, regardless of who they were or where they came from. The Foundation's work would continue, the advocacy would expand, and the culture of healthcare would slowly transform. But it would always be grounded in the simple truth that Maya had learned early in her career and had lived by ever since. Everyone who comes through those doors is someone's whole world, and everyone deserves to be seen, heard, and cared for. With the full measure of human compassion, Michael Harrison had been saved twice that night, once from death and once from a life of unconscious indifference to the suffering of others. Maya Johnson had given him both gifts, and in return, he had given her the resources to extend that same compassion to countless others. It was, Maya thought as she drove home through the streets of Chicago, exactly what healing was supposed to look like. 3 years later, the transformation had become undeniable. The Harrison Foundation's influence had expanded beyond Chicago, establishing programs in 47 cities across the United States. What had begun as one nurse's refusal to accept systemic indifference had evolved into a national movement that was reshaping American healthcare from the ground up. Maya stood before the Senate Health Committee in Washington, D.C., preparing to testify about the Foundation's research on healthcare disparities. The nervous energy she'd felt during her first policy meetings had been replaced by confident expertise. She had learned to speak the language of legislators and bureaucrats while never losing sight of the patients whose stories drove every recommendation. Senators, Maya began, looking directly at each committee member, 3 years ago, I watched a man nearly die, not because of his medical condition, but because of assumptions about his worth as a human being. Today, I'm here to share data from a national pilot program that proves we can eliminate healthcare disparities without compromising quality or increasing costs. The presentation that followed drew on case studies from Foundation partner hospitals across the country. In Phoenix, emergency department wait times for uninsured patients had been reduced by 68% after implementing the Foundation's rapid assessment protocols. In Atlanta, a bias intervention program had resulted in a 43% increase in appropriate pain management for minority patients. In Detroit, the Patient Voice Initiative had identified and corrected 17 instances of discriminatory practices that had been occurring for years without administrative awareness. Senator Margaret Collins from Ohio leaned forward during the question period. Ms. Johnson, these results are impressive, but can you speak to the financial sustainability of these programs? How do we scale compassionate care without bankrupting our healthcare system? Maya had anticipated this question. It was always the first concern raised by policymakers. Senator Collins, our economic analysis shows that early intervention and equitable treatment actually reduce healthcare costs long-term. When patients receive appropriate emergency care immediately, regardless of insurance status, they're less likely to return with complications that require expensive interventions. She clicked to her next slide, showing a graph that had become her most powerful advocacy tool. In our Phoenix pilot site, the total cost of emergency care decreased by 22% over 2 years, despite treating 30% more uninsured patients. This happened because patients were receiving appropriate care at the right time, rather than cycling through the system with untreated complications. Senator David Martinez from Texas nodded thoughtfully. And what about the workforce implications? How do we train enough healthcare providers to implement these protocols nationwide? That's where our nursing scholarship and residency programs become crucial, Maya replied. We're not just funding individual educations, we're transforming how healthcare professionals are trained from day one. Medical schools and nursing programs that partner with our foundation integrate equity training, cultural competency, and patient advocacy into their core curricula. The hearing continued for 3 hours, with Maya fielding questions about implementation challenges, federal funding mechanisms, and integration with existing healthcare infrastructure. But the most powerful moment came when Senator Collins asked her to summarize the human impact of the Foundation's work. Maya paused, thinking about all the individual stories that had brought her to this moment. 3 weeks ago, I received a call from a nurse in Memphis named Patricia Williams. She was caring for a 17-year-old girl named Keisha, who had been brought in unconscious after a drug overdose. 5 years ago, Keisha might have been judged, stigmatized, or given minimal care because of assumptions about addiction and worthiness. Instead, Patricia used our rapid response protocol to stabilize Keisha, our patient advocacy system to involve her family in treatment planning, and our community partnership network to connect her with addiction counseling and educational support. Today, Keisha is a sophomore in college studying social work, and she volunteers with our Patient Voice initiative to help other young people navigate healthcare challenges. Maya looked directly at the committee members. That's the impact we're talking about. Not just statistics about wait times or cost reductions, but young people who are alive and thriving because someone saw them as worth saving. After the hearing, Maya walked through the Capitol building, thinking about how surreal her journey had become. 5 years ago, she had been a hospital nurse focused on individual patient care. Now, she was influencing national healthcare policy, but the core mission remained exactly the same: ensuring that every person received the care and dignity they deserved. Her phone buzzed with a text from Michael. Watched the hearing online. You were incredible. The committee vote is scheduled for next week. Preliminary count suggests we have the support for federal pilot funding. The legislation they were supporting would provide $50 million in federal funding to expand the Foundation's programs to 100 additional hospitals across the country. More importantly, it would establish healthcare equity metrics as a requirement for federal healthcare funding, creating financial incentives for hospitals to eliminate discriminatory practices. Maya's flight back to Chicago was delayed, giving her time to review the latest quarterly reports from Foundation programs. The numbers continued to exceed their projections, but the individual stories remained what motivated her daily work. In Cleveland, a hospital had identified through the Patient Voice initiative that Spanish-speaking patients were waiting significantly longer for interpreter services, leading to delayed diagnoses and treatment. The Foundation helped fund additional interpreter positions and develop real-time translation technology that reduced communication barriers by 85%. In Los Angeles, the Rapid Response Protocol had been adapted to address the unique challenges faced by homeless patients who often avoided seeking medical care due to previous negative experiences with healthcare institutions. A specialized outreach team now worked directly with homeless encampments to provide preventive care and connect individuals with appropriate resources before medical emergencies occurred. In Miami, the Foundation's research had uncovered a troubling pattern of cardiac care disparities, where Black women experiencing heart attacks were significantly less likely to receive timely intervention than white men with identical symptoms. The resulting bias intervention program had eliminated this disparity within 18 months. Each program adaptation taught the Foundation team more about the complex intersection of healthcare, social justice, and institutional change. Maya had learned that effective advocacy required not just compassion and determination, but also sophisticated understanding of economic systems, political processes, and organizational behavior. Back in Chicago, Maya arrived at the Foundation headquarters to find an unexpected visitor waiting in her office. Dr. Sarah Chen, the young resident she had mentored during Michael's hospitalization, was sitting in the chair across from Maya's desk with a nervous smile. "Sarah, what brings you here? Last I heard, you were finishing your emergency medicine residency." "I was," Sarah replied, "but I wanted to talk to you about my career plans. Maya, watching you work with Mr. Harrison changed how I think about medicine. I've been accepted for a fellowship in health policy at Johns Hopkins, but I've also been offered a position as the Foundation's Director of Medical Education. I know it's unconventional to leave clinical practice so early in my career, but Maya sat down, studying the young doctor's face. She saw the same passion and uncertainty she remembered from her own transition from bedside nursing to systemic advocacy. Sarah, what draws you to the education position? The opportunity to shape how the next generation of doctors thinks about patient care. I've been working on a curriculum that integrates clinical skills with social justice principles, teaching medical students to recognize and address healthcare disparities as a core part of their practice. Maya smiled, remembering her own early conversations with Michael about the Foundation's mission. Tell me about this curriculum. Sarah's enthusiasm became evident as she described her vision. First-year medical students would spend time in community health centers, learning to provide care in resource-limited settings. They'd study cases where social determinants of health directly impact medical outcomes. Most importantly, they'd learn to see patient advocacy as an essential clinical skill, not an optional add-on. What about resistance from traditional medical education establishments? That's where the Foundation's influence becomes crucial, Sarah replied. We're not asking medical schools to completely overhaul their programs. We're offering additional resources, funding, and prestige. Students who complete our equity-focused tracks would have priority access to Foundation-supported residencies and career advancement opportunities. Maya found herself nodding as Sarah spoke. This was exactly the kind of systemic thinking that the Foundation needed to scale its impact beyond individual hospital programs. Sarah, I think you should take the position, but I have one condition. You have to maintain some clinical practice. The moment we lose touch with actual patient care, we lose our credibility and our perspective. That evening, Maya attended the monthly board meeting where Sarah's hiring would be officially discussed. The Foundation had grown from Michael's initial vision into a complex organization with over 200 employees, but the board meetings still maintained the intimate, patient-focused atmosphere that had characterized their early work. Michael opened the meeting with an announcement that surprised everyone. I've been offered a position as Secretary of Health and Human Services by the incoming administration. They want someone with private sector experience who also understands healthcare equity issues. The room fell silent as board members processed the implications. Michael's leadership had been central to the Foundation's success, but the opportunity to influence healthcare policy at the federal level was unprecedented. Obviously, I would step down from day-to-day Foundation operations, Michael continued, but Maya and the board would continue the work we've started. In fact, having someone sympathetic to our mission in the federal government could accelerate our policy goals significantly. Dr. Williams raised her hand. Michael, what about the conflict of interest issues? Could your government position compromise the Foundation's independence? That's exactly why Maya's leadership becomes even more important, Michael replied. The Foundation needs to maintain its ability to criticize government healthcare policies when necessary. Maya's clinical background and advocacy record give her the credibility to challenge any administration, including one that I'm part of. Maya felt the familiar mixture of excitement and overwhelming responsibility that had characterized her entire Foundation experience. If the board supports this transition, I'm prepared to take on the expanded leadership role, but I want to be clear about my priorities. Patient care and healthcare equity will always come before political considerations. The discussion that followed revealed how much the Foundation had evolved from its origins in one patient's near-death experience. They were now influencing medical education, federal policy, and healthcare delivery systems across the country. But Maya insisted that every major decision be evaluated through the lens of a single question. How does this help the next patient who arrives unconscious and unidentified at an emergency department? As the meeting concluded, Maya walked through the Foundation's community clinic one final time before heading home. The evening shift was bustling with patients receiving primary care, mental health services, and health education. In the waiting room, she noticed a familiar face, Robert Washington, the formerly homeless man who had been in the bed next to Michael during his recovery. Robert was now working as a peer counselor, helping other patients navigate the healthcare system and connecting them with social services. When he saw Maya, his face lit up with recognition. "Ms. Maya, how are you doing? I heard you testified in Washington this week." "I'm doing well, Robert. How are you settling into your new apartment?" "It's wonderful. I never thought I'd have my own place again. And this job with the Foundation, it gives my life purpose. I get to help people who are going through what I went through." Maya smiled, remembering the cognitive damage that Robert had sustained due to delayed medical care. His recovery had been remarkable, but it served as a constant reminder of how different his outcome might have been if he had received immediate treatment like Michael had. "Robert, I want you to know that your story has been part of every presentation I've given about healthcare equity. Your experience helps people understand why this work matters." "I'm glad something good came from all that pain," Robert replied. "And Ms. Maya, I want you to know that you didn't just save Mr. Harrison that night. You saved me too, and everyone else who benefits from this foundation." As Maya finally headed home that evening, she reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. What had begun as a single nurse's refusal to accept systemic indifference had grown into a national movement that was transforming American healthcare. But the core mission remained exactly the same, ensuring that every person, regardless of their social status or ability to pay, received the dignity and care they deserved in their moments of greatest vulnerability. The work was far from finished, but Maya knew that the Foundation had created something sustainable and powerful. Even as leadership roles shifted and federal policies changed, the culture of healthcare was evolving toward greater equity and compassion. And it all started with one fundamental principle: that every human life has equal value, and every patient deserves someone willing to fight for them when they cannot fight for themselves. 2 months after Michael's confirmation as Secretary of Health and Human Services, Maya found herself standing before the largest gathering of healthcare professionals in American history. The National Healthcare Equity Summit had drawn over 15,000 attendees to Chicago's McCormick Place, representing hospitals, nursing schools, medical colleges, and community health organizations from every state. The summit was Maya's idea, born from her recognition that sustainable change required more than policy mandates or foundation funding. It required a fundamental shift in how healthcare professionals saw their role in society. The event's opening ceremony took place in the same convention hall where Michael had once delivered keynote speeches about market efficiency and profit optimization. Now the stage was set for a very different kind of conversation. 5 years ago, Maya began her opening address. "I was a hospital nurse who believed that treating patients with dignity was simply part of the job. I didn't understand that dignity was actually a privilege reserved for those who could afford it, or those who looked like they deserved it." The audience, a sea of doctors, nurses, administrators, and healthcare advocates, listened with the kind of attention that came from recognizing their own experiences in her words. Today, we're here because that assumption was wrong. Dignity in healthcare isn't automatic. It's a choice that every medical professional makes dozens of times each day. The choice to see someone as fully human, regardless of how they're dressed, where they're from, or how they're paying for their care. Maya's presentation included video testimonials from patients whose lives had been transformed by foundation programs, but also from healthcare workers who had discovered new meaning in their careers through equity-focused practice. Dr. Amanda Foster, an emergency physician from rural Kentucky, described how implementing bias training had changed her approach to treating patients with substance use disorders. "I realized I had been making assumptions about people's worth based on their addiction status," Dr. Foster said in the video. "The Foundation's training helped me understand that addiction is a medical condition, not a moral failing. Now I treat every person struggling with addiction as someone's beloved family member, because that's exactly what they are." The summit's workshop sessions revealed the depth and breadth of innovation happening across the healthcare equity movement. In one session, Dr. James Liu from Seattle Children's Hospital presented research on pediatric pain management disparities, showing how unconscious bias affected treatment decisions for children as young as 2 years old. His intervention program had eliminated racial disparities in pain medication administration within 6 months. Another session featured Maria Santos, a community health worker from the Rio Grande Valley who had developed a cross-border healthcare coordination program for undocumented immigrants. Working with foundation support, her team had created a network that ensured continuity of care for patients who moved between Mexico and the United States, preventing medical emergencies that resulted from interrupted treatment. Perhaps the most powerful session was led by former patients who had become healthcare equity advocates. Keisha Williams, the teenager Maya had mentioned in her congressional testimony, now spoke to medical students about the experience of receiving stigma-free addiction treatment. Her presentation consistently moved audiences to tears as she described the difference between being seen as a problem to be managed versus a person to be healed. "When I was brought to the emergency room unconscious from an overdose, I could have been treated as just another drug-seeking teenager," Keisha told the audience. "Instead, the nurse who cared for me saw me as someone's daughter, someone with potential, someone worth saving. That perspective didn't just save my life. It changed the entire trajectory of my future." During the summit's policy forum, Maya found herself in conversation with healthcare leaders who were grappling with implementation challenges in their own institutions. Dr. Rachel Green, the chief medical officer at a large hospital system in Dallas, approached Maya during a break between sessions. "Maya, I want to implement your rapid response protocol, but I'm facing resistance from our financial team. They're concerned about the costs of treating more uninsured patients." Maya had heard this concern countless times, and her response had evolved through experience. "Dr. Green, have you calculated the current costs of undertreating uninsured patients? When someone receives inadequate emergency care and returns 3 times sicker, the eventual cost is exponentially higher than providing appropriate care initially." She pulled out her tablet and showed Dr. Green a cost analysis from a Dallas area hospital that had implemented foundation protocols. "Your colleague at Methodist Hospital saw a 37% reduction in readmissions for uninsured patients after implementing our program. The improved outcomes more than offset the initial treatment costs." Dr. Green studied the data with growing interest. "These numbers are compelling, but how do I convince board members who are focused on quarterly profits rather than long-term community health?" What began as one nurse's refusal to accept the unacceptable has become a blueprint for transforming American healthcare, Michael said. "The Department of Health and Human Services is implementing Maya's rapid response protocols as a requirement for federal healthcare funding. Hospitals that demonstrate persistent care disparities will face financial penalties, while those that achieve equity benchmarks will receive bonus payments." The policy announcement represented a historic shift in federal healthcare oversight, moving beyond traditional quality metrics to include equity measures as core indicators of institutional performance. Maya watched from backstage as the audience of healthcare professionals responded with sustained applause, recognizing the significance of federal policy finally aligning with their professional values. After the summit concluded, Maya spent the evening in the Foundation's original community clinic, working her monthly nursing shift alongside the staff who'd been her colleagues before she became a national healthcare advocate. The juxtaposition felt important, staying connected to direct patient care while influencing policy at the highest levels of government. Her patient that evening was an 8-year-old boy named Marcus, who had been brought in by his grandmother for persistent cough and fever. As Maya assessed his symptoms, she recognized the signs of pneumonia that had likely gone untreated for weeks due to lack of insurance coverage. "Mom, when did Marcus first start coughing?" Maya asked the grandmother, a woman in her 60s who was clearly exhausted from worry and sleepless nights. "About 3 weeks ago, but it's gotten much worse this week. I didn't know where to take him. We don't have insurance, and the county hospital is so far away." Maya felt the familiar anger that still arose when she encountered preventable suffering caused by healthcare barriers. "You brought him to exactly the right place. We're going to take excellent care of Marcus, and we're going to make sure he gets all the follow-up care he needs." As she administered antibiotics and arranged for chest x-rays, Maya reflected on how this case would have been handled differently in various healthcare settings. In some emergency departments, Marcus might have faced long waits, inadequate follow-up, or subtle discrimination based on his family's insurance status. But here, in the Foundation's clinic, he received the same quality of care that any child would receive, regardless of ability to pay. The grandmother's relief was palpable as Maya explained Marcus's treatment plan and scheduled follow-up appointments. "Nurse Maya, I don't know how to thank you. I was so scared that something terrible was going to happen to him." "You don't need to thank me," Maya replied. "This is what healthcare is supposed to look like for every child, in every clinic, every time." Later that evening, as Maya completed her documentation and prepared to leave the clinic, she received a phone call from Jennifer Walsh, who was now overseeing Foundation programs in 12 states from the regional office in Atlanta. "Maya, I wanted to update you on the evaluation results from our first-year nursing scholars," Jennifer said. "The retention rates are incredible. 94% of our scholarship recipients are still working in underserved communities 2 years after graduation, compared to 38% for traditional nursing graduates." The scholarship program had become one of Maya's proudest achievements, not just because it was producing compassionate healthcare providers, but because it was changing the demographic composition of the nursing profession. 68% of Foundation scholars came from backgrounds similar to the communities they served, bringing cultural understanding and lived experience that enhanced patient care. More importantly, Jennifer continued, the patient satisfaction scores in hospitals with high concentrations of our scholars are consistently higher across all demographic groups. Our graduates aren't just staying in underserved areas, they're transforming the culture of patient care wherever they work. As Maya drove home through the Chicago neighborhoods where she had grown up, she passed the street corner where Michael Harrison had collapsed 5 years earlier. The area had changed dramatically. New community health centers, improved public transportation, and economic development that had brought resources to previously neglected communities. The Foundation's work had extended far beyond healthcare, influencing housing policy, education initiatives, and economic development programs that address the social determinants of health. Maya had learned that sustainable healthcare equity required addressing the underlying conditions that made people sick, not just treating the symptoms of inequality. Her phone buzzed with a text message from a number she didn't recognize. Ms. Johnson, my name is David Chen. My mother was treated at your clinic last year when she was having chest pains. You probably don't remember her, but your care saved her life and inspired me to apply to nursing school. I just got accepted to the Harrison Foundation Scholarship Program. Thank you for showing me what nursing can be. Maya smiled as she read the message, thinking about the ripple effects of individual acts of compassion. Every patient interaction had the potential to influence not just that person's health, but their family's perception of healthcare, their community's trust in medical institutions, and the next generation's career choices. She typed back, "Congratulations, David. I look forward to working with you as you begin your nursing career. Remember that every patient you care for is someone's whole world." As Maya pulled into her driveway, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from hospital bedside to national healthcare leadership. The work was more complex now, involving policy analysis, budget negotiations, and strategic planning. But at its core, it remained exactly the same mission she had embraced as a young nurse, seeing every person as worthy of care, dignity, and compassion. The foundation had proven that healthcare equity wasn't just a moral imperative. It was an achievable goal that improved outcomes for everyone while reducing overall costs. What had begun with one nurse's refusal to accept systemic indifference had become a movement that was transforming how America cared for its most vulnerable citizens. Maya knew that the real measure of their success wouldn't be found in policy, documents, or budget allocations, but in the experiences of individual patients who received compassionate care in their moments of greatest need. Every Marcus who got prompt treatment for pneumonia, every Keisha who was treated with dignity during addiction recovery, every Robert who found purpose after homelessness. These were the victories that made all the complex work of systemic change worthwhile. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.